Beyond Citadel is a retro boomer shooter and sequel to the Citadel that came to my attention through its popularity on the Steam page. The reviews are extremely glowing with an overwhelming positive 96%. Now these kind of titles can often have a pretty thin narrative, and that doesn't tend to bother me if the moment-to-moment gameplay is good enough. One of the big selling points of Beyond Citadel is its realistic gunplay, giving the nostalgia of 90s shooters with a more in-depth mechanic for reloading, cocking your weapons, and even having guns jam if you don't take care of them. I really liked this idea, but is this enough to carry the title to a victory? Let's see. The story is told in a way that I've come to expect from Japanese titles. A collection of kind of obtuse riddles told to us either directly by NPCs or in the world itself through books or other environmental objects. Essentially, the end of the world has come, and we play as the Martyr, a fully armed and fully boobed hero of the angels, come to fight through the forces of the trumpeters of the apocalypse and save what remains of humanity. Aesthetically, it reminded me of Wolfenstein 3D from the 90s, just with anime girls heavily sprinkled on top. Whether you're going to enjoy this game or not, largely will be dependent on your level of tolerance for the frequent occurrences of irrationally underdressed women. How can the armourer be a nun in a G-banger? And levels of gratuitous violence. The gameplay is as basic as it comes. Get from the start of each level to the end of each level without filling your scantily clad body with too many bullet holes. To help you along your way, there's an assortment of weapons to choose from. The standard melee like knives and axes, to pistols, shotguns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, RPGs, detonators, and a few more. At the start of the game, you can choose whether you want to contend with the weapon degradation system. As you use them, your guns will deteriorate, and the worse their condition, the more likely they are to misfire or jam. Now this sounds like a potentially frustrating mechanic, but weirdly, it actually became one of my favourite things about this game. You can be laying waste with the assault rifle, and suddenly the torrent of bullets will stop, and you'll see the message, jammed. The rifle, sir.
It appears to be jammed.
And have to quickly take cover and unjam it before it's able to operate again. It gave this wildly unrealistic game some semblance of normality, and I found it strangely comforting. With some of the guns you can also quick reload, meaning your reload is faster, but you're sacrificing whatever leftover bullets you had in that mag as you toss it aside to reach for a fresh one. You'll also be able to remove the mag from some guns, refill, and replace it. Or with some of the rifles, replace the ammo bullet by bullet before cocking the gun to restore it to working order. There are benches throughout the game where you can upgrade your favourite weapons and outfit them with larger mags or laser sights or what have you. You'll be collecting cogs that are dropped from the enemies, and that acts as a type of currency for repairing your weapons at these benches, decreasing the chances of jams. The enemies you'll be fighting are an assortment of demons, axe wielders, soldiers, commandos, and snipers, and the occasional cyber wizard. If you venture outside of home base, you'll find an inn where you can adjust the difficulty of each type of enemy with tokens, giving you the ability to dial back the frustration of one specific foe, which is a pretty neat mechanic. Having said that, the enemy AI can be pretty stupid. This guy literally grenaded himself to death. But it's fairly in keeping with what could be expected with this style of game. There's also armoured enemies like tanks and walkers too. At the end of each of the chapters, you'll have a boss fight with one of the trumpeters. These can range from being a cakewalk to being pretty tricky, but a lot came down to taking whatever cover you can and firing when possible. Afterwards, you get treated to some flashback level where you eat tea and cake with your little brother and have more of those cryptic chats. The gameplay at the start of the game is pretty much like it is at the end of the game, and the same could be said of the enemies. The variety doesn't really alter that much through the game, which was a little bit disappointing. And that might sound harsh considering there are sequences where you get to pilot a tank or even a walker, which is pretty neat actually, but they weren't long enough for me to break the feeling of sameness. There's a couple of underwater levels too, because what's a game without underwater levels, right? You'll note that after you've killed enemies, their armor will break off and reveal that they have the same face as your character. I wasn't able to tell from the lore in the game whether this was an intentional detail. Maybe all the humans left are simply clones of one person, the Martyr, and they've been brainwashed by the trumpeters. In fact, there was some line I read in the game about a big amount of humanity being turned to fight for the apocalypse. So maybe that's it. Or are they the same because it was easier for the solo developer to code the sprites that way? Now, I didn't play the original, and maybe there's more context from that game, so if you know, let me know about it in the comments. From From killing your enemies, I want to talk about when your character kicks the bucket. When you die, you'll be forced to restart the level again, unless you found the cryo chamber that gives you a second life. This game is pretty gruesome, and when you die, your injuries are splayed on your avatar in the bottom left corner. You'll also sometimes see bits of your corpse splayed out on the screen in visceral detail. And when I say visceral, I mean literal viscera. Bowel, spleen, spine, you get the point. I guess this is a good time to talk about the graphics a bit more. Beyond Citadel is obviously a retro title, so the textures are very of the 90s. From the outside areas of home base having that repetitive dirt texture, to some of the walls you'll find in the levels. The whole thing screams nostalgia. It looks deceptively simplistic, but on closer inspection you'll see the amount of work that's gone into the graphics and the design of this world. Enemies, when downed, won't just always fall over. Sometimes they'll stare at you, hatred in their eyes as they take their final breath. Sometimes they'll level a pistol at you and desperately fire the last few bullets they have. And sometimes they won't fire at all, just aiming at you with an empty chamber until they expire. It's a small detail and one that would be easily missed, but it injected so much to the experience I couldn't help but be impressed. There's a good amount of verticality in the levels, which occasionally made me feel lost, and there were a couple of times where I needed to puzzle out where I should go next, having to smash a window and jump balconies to continue my slaughter. I would be surprised if this game taxed any modern PC setup, so I think it would be safe to say it's fairly smooth in terms of performance. Having said that, I did see some comments on the Steam store page that there were a few bugs that made the game unplayable for some people. I can't say I had anything like that in my game time. The only bug I came across in my entire playthrough was this failure of characters to load, making it look like I'm having a conversation with a wall. Now I have to circle back to that fan service side of things in this section because it's a big part of this game and perhaps its appeal to some. There is a lot of animated cleavage. If you watch fan service anime, you'll be fairly well catered to here. Speaking personally, I found it just a little bit off-putting how obvious it all was, particularly on the background of selling realistic gunplay. It's great that there's realistic gunplay, but it's just a little weird that so much effort has been put into magazine animations and pistol cocking mechanisms, as well as weapons jamming, when your character is wearing not much more than a stark white G-string. You can find and equip armor in the levels, and actually see that displayed in the avatar below, which looks pretty badass. But I don't know, for me, I'd at least be wearing a t-shirt and pants when running into gunfire. But what do I know? I know it's clearly a genre, and in researching this game, I learned a new word, guro, whole other thing. Look, I lived in Japan for a time, so I get that there's definitely an audience for this style. I guess I'm just realizing it's not for me, and that's fine. Moving on. Similar to the graphics, the sound has a narrow banding feel to it, very 90s. Gunfire sounds nice and hefty, and I like the sounds as the magazine slips out of the rifles. The enemy dying yelps come in swaths, and you'll even hear some of them breathing in your headphones as you pass them by, if they're out of the fight but not yet dead. The music was pretty interesting. In the menu, you'll be treated to a floating melancholic piano tune that's so classic of Japanese anime in its blatant dissociative nature from the actual contents of the game. It's a nice melody though. The level music I found could get a little repetitive in places, and occasionally this was pretty distracting. Having said that, there are definitely little gems throughout the game. A particular favourite of mine being early in the game in level 1-4, a kind of lo-fi synth wave track with a high-toned xylophone in the background that sounds like a bird. It was giving me Citizen Sleeper OST vibes, and that's the highest of compliments. Overall, the soundtrack was very rarely dull and had moments that were surprisingly pleasant. In the end, I had a lot more to say than I thought I initially would about Beyond Citadel. I found the story interesting but obtusely told, which I don't tend to like. The weapons and the gunplay is excellent, and this was the clear highlight for me. I actually hope that this weapon degradation and jamming mechanic gets utilised in other games as well. The feel of the guns and the multitude of ways that I could interact with the guns was something that I definitely appreciated and enjoyed. The soundtrack was a bit of a mixed bag, from some tracks being annoyingly repetitive to others being haunting and beautiful. As I said, no matter what I was listening to, it was very rarely dull. The anime fan service nature of the graphics were just a little overused for me, to the point that it actually detracted from my enjoyment of the game as a whole. As I said before, there's definitely an audience for this game, I'm just not it. I think it will be pretty immediately obvious to you if this is a game that you'll be interested in or not. As such, I've given it a yellow grading, reflecting that it's not something I'd recommend to everyone, but some people will have a good time with this.